Hi, this is Andrew Abrams with RECUR360, and today I'm going to review a little bit more in depth our Avalara AvaTax sales tax integration, which can be used as a standalone integration with Avalara, where RECUR360 will calculate your sales tax on your invoices, whether the transaction was created in RECUR360 to begin with, or if it was imported from QuickBooks. As well as you can also still use the native Avalara integration with QuickBooks and just let that feed to our system for automated workflows and payment processing. So let's jump in. To begin with, we've already recorded a previous video by my colleague Barb about integrating Avalara with your RECUR360. And so I'm going to take it from there and make it a little bit more in depth. Today, we're going to be looking at Avalara with QuickBooks Desktop. The integration works the same with QuickBooks Online, and we'll have a separate QuickBooks Online related tutorial covering the same options. Inside of your RECUR360, there are a few settings that have to be made for the integration to work properly. One of them is to go to our integrations module and under Avalara, connect it to your Avalara email address related to your account with your Avalara password. And after you connect that, we want to make sure that two things are set up inside of QuickBooks. One is the R360 AvaTax sales tax item and the R360 AvaTax code. The R360 AvaTax code is the trigger for our system to know to calculate sales tax on an invoice, whether you create it on our end or create it in QuickBooks. And the R360 AvaTax sales tax service item is what's used to add to invoices in QuickBooks. So on the QuickBooks side, if you were to go to your items list, you're going to want to create those two items if they don't already exist. The first one being the sales tax code, and that should be set at a rate of 0. And you're going to map that to a tax agency called Avalara, because Avalara will be filing and paying your tax returns, and they're going to be pulling the money from you. So they would be the tax agency on file. And then the second component is the R360 AvaTax sales tax item, which is a service item. And that gets set to a rate of 0 and a tax code of none. And you're going to want to map that to an other current liability in your chart of accounts. And you could call it R360 AvaTax sales tax or sales tax payable or what have you. The important thing is you don't want to map that to the default sales tax liability account in QuickBooks because you're not going to be paying out of that account in the native QuickBooks format. Then the additional configurations would be related to tax code mapping. So you can go to our tax code mapping and import in a mapping file between your QuickBooks item number and your Avalara tax category. Or you can map items individually, like so if I was going to map computer, I've got that mapped to the computer software business to business Avalara code of DC01000. I also have a test service item, and that's currently not mapped to anything. So therefore, it's going to pick up a default sales tax calculation in Avalara unless we set it to non-taxable on the transaction. So we have primarily two workflows, well, three actually, that work with Avalara. One is you can create your transactions inside of Recur directly as a single invoice or a recurring invoice. So if we were to set up a recurring invoice, you would do add new, choose your customer, set if you're going to automatically process payment and on what date of the payment, and that you're going to email it to them. And then you're going to choose when the interval is on this invoice. So let's say this is something you're going to charge for on the 1st of every month. And when is that going to start? So I'm going to go ahead and say this starts on the 1st of every month, but we want to backdate an invoice today. So I'm going to choose to prorate or backdate so that today we'll process a transaction. And then I'm going to go ahead and just add a couple items in here. I'm going to set this to our IT services class, and I'm just going to choose our test service item, and there'll be a quantity of 1 on that for $10. And I'm just going to say not to prorate it, so it charges the full amount for this month. And the minute that we add that item, as long as the R360 AvaTax code is the tax item on the transaction, in real time, we will calculate what the tax will be when this transaction processes. And as you can see within our tax item in the invoice item section, we break out the tax items based on however Avalara calculates it, and that adds it to the total. So if I submit this, this is what will run on 9/1. I'll just change that. So you can see what your transaction is going to look like in the future. So that's one way of staging a transaction in our system. The other way is just to do a direct invoice. So if we go into our invoicing center and we create a new invoice, this is a one-time invoice. We'll choose our customer. We'll choose whether we're going to auto process the payment or not, and whether we're going to email it to them. And again, in the same manner, when I add an item to this, let's say we're selling them a computer, and that's taxable. So this is the tax on the order so far. And if I add a service item, and let's say in your state that this is non-taxable, this would be a non-taxable service. Or you would have a mapping inside of Avalara on the different types of service items you have, and it'll determine that. In this case, I'm just going to set it to non-taxable. And as you can see, our tax remains the same at $41.25. And also on our line items, if I wanted to put a service date on it, so let's say the service was performed today, I could add that as well. And anytime you add or modify an item in here, we auto-calculate the sales tax that Avalara deems is required on the transaction, as long as this is the line or the item tax code at the bottom of the transaction. So I'm going to go ahead and create this invoice, and it's going to create it now. And then it's going to email that to the customer, process payment on it, and email it to the customer. And then it's also going to queue it to write it into our QuickBooks. So if I look in our sync status, I'm going to see that there's an invoice pending sync to QuickBooks as well as a payment. And if I go look at my email, we'll see that in the email that I just received, it's got the details of what the transaction was for, the breakout of the sales tax, and the fact that it was paid. And one of our settings is to show account balance information. We also attach a PDF, so you can preview that, and that will show similar data to the customer. In order to see all of this content, you do also want to make sure that you go into our settings email and you check off all of the appropriate invoice link settings for what you want to show when they click on the view or pay open invoice, as well as our invoice settings and our PDF settings for what you want to see on that transaction when the customer receives it. One of the things that you'll want to do is suppress the QuickBooks sales tax item, which when it goes to QuickBooks shows as 0%, sales tax code, excuse me, because in the sales tax item that we have, it breaks out the sales tax calculations. So we don't need it repeated on here that the tax is 0 when it's in line on the invoice. So the next time I go ahead and sync that into QuickBooks, I'm going to run my web connector. And I'm going to run this manually right now. And as you can see in the background, we're going to see for Avalara test customer, we're going to see a new R360 invoice 1006 come in and apply a payment to it. And so if we go into QuickBooks, it essentially looks the same as it does inside of RECUR, as you'd expect, because we're writing the data into QuickBooks as if it was created there. So now on the reverse, you could create and or import invoices into QuickBooks. And if you want RECUR to calculate the sales tax, You just have to make sure that you have R360-AvaTax as your tax item. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to create a copy of this invoice. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to delete off this line item here so that it automatically gets calculated. Now you have two options. You can again use RECUR360 to do all of your sales tax calculation, or you could use a hybrid model of where you may also use the native Avalara integration in QuickBooks Desktop or QuickBooks Online to let QuickBooks calculate the sales tax, in which case RECUR360 would just automate payment processing and emailing of the invoice. So if I were to switch this to use the native AvaTax item, what that means is QuickBooks is going to calculate the sales tax with AvaTax when you go save it. And so when I hit save here, it then launches the AvaTax integration and it adds that tax amount to it. But you'll notice that within QuickBooks' native AvaTax integration, it doesn't give you a breakout of the different tax codes like we do on the RECUR360 side. So that's one of the biggest differences between the two platforms. The second one is as you change items on the transaction in QuickBooks, so let's say we're going to do 2 test services, it doesn't recalculate in real time the sales tax as you're adding those items. It only calculates it once you hit save in QuickBooks. And in this case, because the test service is non-taxable, there therefore isn't additional tax on it. So we could leave this invoice as it is and then let it sink into Recur, and then we'll automate the payment processing and the emailing from there. Or if you, again, create invoices directly in QuickBooks, either through time and materials from, say, T-Sheets, or you have some other system that writes invoices into QuickBooks, or even if you're still using the memorized transactions list in QuickBooks, the trigger then is to use our R360 AvaTax item on the transaction inside of QuickBooks. And that way, when it syncs into our system, we will then calculate the sales tax, then process the payment, then email it to the customer, and then write it back to QuickBooks. So I'm going to go ahead and save and close this. And right now that created transaction 15 for $770. You'll also notice just that in our RECUR360, I had set RECUR360 to create its own invoice numbers so that you know what invoices came from Recur versus the ones you created in QuickBooks, where it picks up on the next internal QuickBooks invoice number. So I'm going to go over to Recur, and at 6 a.m. and 6 p.m., we do an automatic sync. We also, anytime we create a transaction in Recur, it queues a sync as well. So I'm going to, since there's a sync already queued, I'm just going to go ahead and run the web connector. And I'm just going to do an update manually. You could also set this to auto run every 30 minutes or 300 minutes or however as often as you want. Now, while this manual sync is running, the first thing that's happening is it's going to sync in any upcoming tasks that we have queued to go. Then we're going to sync all data with QuickBooks, and it's during this sync task that we're going to import that invoice in, and then continue on with our automations of sales tax calc, payment processing if you have the customer set to auto pay, as well as emailing it out. So once this makes 100%, now if I go into my customer center and I go to my test customer and we go into view all invoices, we're now going to see that QuickBooks invoice 15. And as you can see, the amount on it is $811.25, where in QuickBooks originally, that was $770. And if we drill into that invoice in our system, you will see that we automatically calculated and added the sales tax, and that we processed the payment, and therefore there's no balance due. And then if you go look into your email, you will see a copy of that transaction that instead of the original 770, it now has the tax added. And then that was emailed out to the customer. Again, this is invoice number 15. So after we do all of our automations, we then queue that to sync back to QuickBooks. So we're now syncing the updated invoice with the sales tax on it, the payment that we processed and applied to it, and then again, our overall sync all data with QuickBooks to pick up any other changes. So I'm going to go ahead here and do an update selected, or just let it run naturally. And now over here, you'll see the value of this invoice changed to 811.25. And then also a payment came in for 811.25. So now if we go look at that invoice in QuickBooks, it now has our tax service item with the additional taxes line itemed out. Again, the native Avalara integration doesn't do this, only ours, and our tax item at the bottom. Now, if you were going to edit this in QuickBooks, and let's say you wanted to modify it, what you would want to do then is remove the tax. And then let's say we're upping this to 2 now, okay? We're gonna go ahead and save this transaction. Now there's payments applied to it, so actually we can't remove that tax item off of it. Let me revert this for a moment. And I'm just gonna update this to 2 computers. Let's say they wanted 2 instead, okay? So now they have a balance due, but we already have a sales tax on it, and that's fine. What we'll go ahead and do is we will save this. Okay, and there's a balance due of $750. And inside of RECUR, I'm going to go ahead and do a sync with QuickBooks again so that it picks up those changes. And now I'll run the web connector, let it run on its interval. And what will happen is when that comes in, we will recalculate the sales tax, add it to the transaction, and then process the remaining payment on it. So once this gets to 100%, we'll go take a look at that invoice again. So I'm going to go to my customer center or my invoice center, or our, in our reporting, you can also go look at your invoice history report. So now that that's 100%, I'm going to go to my customer center. I'm going to go to my Avalara test customer, and I'm going to go look at all my invoices. And now we're going to go look at invoice 15. And now you'll notice that the balance due is $791.25. Okay. In this case, it didn't automatically process the payment because I didn't have that automation turned on, but we can manually process it. To auto process it, we would go to settings and account. And we would just want to make sure that on the invoice import, that if they're set to auto pay, that we process immediately and then send an email out. But in this case, because we modified the transaction, it's not a new transaction to recur, so it only recalculated the sales tax, but didn't auto process the payment. So again, if I go back to my customers and I go back to my Avalara test customer and I go to view all invoices, and we take a look at invoice 15 here, we see that we recalculated it. And now I can just go ahead and manually process a payment if that's what my intent is. So we're going to do that, and we'll automatically email it to the customer. Okay, so that payment was successful, and now it's queued to sync over to QuickBooks. So on the next run of the web connector, all that you'll see differently is on the QuickBooks side, you'll see that the invoice total amount is updated, then the open balance is updated, and then the new payment came in to apply to it. And if we open this up in QuickBooks, we'll see the total. And if we go to the reporting and we go to the transaction history, you'll see the 2 different payments auto applied to it. Okay, so as a recap, with our Avalara API integration, you could use just RECUR360 connected to Avalara to calculate sales tax on all the invoices generated directly in RECUR. The caveat is you have to use the R360-AvaTax item as your tax code on your transactions as the trigger in our system. And when our system calculates the sales tax, it adds it with any applicable taxes that get broken out on the Avalara side. so that the two systems match between RECUR360 and Avalara. We process the transaction, we process the payment, we email it to the customer. And then we queue it to write it to QuickBooks. And then the other workflow is you could create or import invoices into QuickBooks. And as long as they have this R360 AvaTax item on it at the bottom, when it syncs up to Recur, we'll know to process the sales tax before we do anything else with the transaction. Okay. Now, let's say you are going to use Avalara's tax calculation. So in that case, if we go ahead and we create a copy of this invoice and make it invoice 16, I'll up this to 3 items so it's a little different. And then I'm going to delete this line item down here. And I'm going to switch it to using one of the AvaTax QuickBooks desktop integration tax items. So I'm going to go ahead and save this. And I don't want to make it permanent for all future transactions. I just want to save it for this transaction. Okay, so Avalara, the native integration, calculated the tax. We're using the AvaTax item, and this is their balance due. So on the next sync with Recur, we'll go ahead and queue another manual sync here. Now you wouldn't do this after every transaction. You would just let it sync the twice a day, or you could do it intraday if you prefer. And when we do this, what you'll see is that invoice will just come in as is, and we are not gonna do another sales tax calculation on it because you're not using our R360 AvaTax item. But what we will do is process the payment, email it to the customer, and then queue the payment to write back to QuickBooks. So we'll just let this get to 100%. And when that's complete, we'll see the invoice on our end and that the payment was processed and that an email was sent out. So in this regards, you're just using our system to automate payment processing and emailing of the customer rather than doing it one by one in QuickBooks, meaning create the invoice, process the payment, and email it individually, or even using the QuickBooks bulk email feature, you still have to process payment one by one. So by using our workflows, you can just create your invoices in QuickBooks, sync them up into our end, and then we automate it from there. So now if I go look at the invoice that just came over via email, we'll see that the amount is paid and it's just transferring over what came from QuickBooks directly. You'll notice this was calculated directly by AvaTax and it doesn't have the breakout of what the tax code is because we calculated that directly in QuickBooks originally. And now if we look at my sync status, we'll see that a payment is just waiting to write back. So the next time that the web connector runs, it's just going to go ahead and update QuickBooks that this invoice no longer has a balance due and that it synced the payment over to it. I'm sorry, invoice 16, because it was a different one. All right, so that's the little bit more in-depth demo of your hybrid workflows with AvaTax and RECUR360, or just using RECUR360 to calculate all your sales tax, or just using QuickBooks to calculate all your sales tax with the native Avalara AvaTax integration, and then just using RECUR360 for your automations. If you do have any questions in app, you can go to our support chat, and that'll just pop up at the bottom of our website here, or you can email us at support@recur360.com. We also appreciate any feedback you might have or any other feature requests in related to Avalara. So thank you very much for your time today.